Hi everybody, welcome back to Garden Obsessed. My name is Carla. I've got Lola here beside me all curled up. It's a freezing November day. It's currently snowing. It flurried earlier today. This is probably our first snowfall. I don't think it's gonna stick around. It's not even really collecting much on the ground, a little bit on the deck. And we've got our fuzzy blanket, we've got the fireplace going, and I've got my computer here and my spreadsheet, and it's one of my favorite topics today. We are talking dahlias. So last year I made like a successes, failures, and favorites video to just kind of summarize my dahlia season, and I have referenced it a couple of times trying to remember, what worked, what didn't work, what my favorites were last year, what they are this year. And I wanted to kind of do another one of those. I think I'll do one annually just as a reminder and summary of the season. And hopefully some of you find it interesting as well. But if not, it's a record for myself. So, I thought we would start with failures. Let's get the cruddy stuff out of the way first. So what did we have for failures this year? I don't know that this was a failure per se, but it was a little disappointing. I did order quite a few dahlias this year. I'm going to say, I think I had, these are ballpark, don't quote me on it, but I think I had around 20 varieties last year and added about 50 this year. So we were sitting right around 70 when the season started. There were a couple, like Diva was one, for example, that I had wanted and, was ordering a few other tubers from a few different places, and was on like a short list or like a back ordered list. Didn't end up getting that one, and there were a couple others, so that was more like a disappointment. So that's but out of 50 tubers, to not get like 3 or 4 was okay. I definitely had my hands full, which we'll get to. So as many of the tubers that I was growing this year were new to me, depending on where I ordered them from, many of them arrived later than when I was pre-sprouting some of the ones that I had from last year. So they didn't have as much time to get pre-sprouted, and many of those were ones that didn't make it to bloom this year. So overall, not necessarily because they were late arriving, because I had about 10 from last year that also didn't bloom due to a different reason, which we'll talk about next. But about 14 of the new ones that I ordered this year also didn't bloom. So that was about a third total of all the dahlias that I grew this year that didn't produce a single bloom. The second contributing factor to that I think was a failure on my part this year was getting them planted late. Like, not necessarily started in pots late, which that did happen for some, but actually going into the ground. I don't think I put my first dahlia into the ground until the second week of June, and only about a third got planted at that time. Many of them didn't get planted until late July into the ground. And that did contribute to fewer blooms and also fewer tubers. There were some that when I dug them up didn't produce any tubers, so I'm trying to overwinter the mothers, which will present its own issues. But that's my fault for not getting them in the ground right away. When I dug them up this year, the first few that I cut down, there was a frost I had some at the community garden and some planted at home. And the ones that I had at the community garden got frosted quite a bit earlier than they did at home. At home, I had the ability to cover them at night if we were expecting a frost. So they were completely unprotected at the community garden, and I left them I went in and chopped the stalks back, and then I left them for about a week before I dug them up, and I think that was a mistake. We did have a little bit of rain, and it actually rotted out a few of the tubers. The water got down into the stem and started rotting right at the base of the plant where, you know, the tubers attached to the crown. So that was a lesson learned and a failure from this year. I hope not to repeat. Last year I dug them up the day I cut them down, and I know there's kind of two schools of thought. Some people think they need to harden off in the ground for a week first. Other people don't think that's necessary and dig them up right away. And I think just to prevent the risk of having the same thing happen that happened this year, I won't be leaving them. Going forward, I'm going to dig them up fairly quickly, like maybe 1 or 2 days, but not a week. So we talked about, you know, the lack of tubers for some of the plants this year. Another problem that I had was difficulty getting vermiculite this year. Last year I had far fewer tubers and was able to just go to Canadian Tire and buy like the 9-liter bags. I think there's a lot more people growing dahlias this year, and that local supply wasn't available to me, so I had to order some vermiculite, and I hadn't prepared for that ahead of time. So I had tubers that needed to be stored, and I had no vermiculite. I tried to wrap them in newspapers. Well, I left them for a few days, and of course they started drying out, so my vermiculite was nowhere to be seen, and I had no idea how long it would be, so I was like, okay, I have to figure out a plan B here. So I wrapped them in newspapers and put them in the plastic bins that I store them in vermiculite, thinking that that would be okay temporarily for a week until the vermiculite arrived. Well, when the vermiculite arrived, some of those tubers had actually molded. It was too moist in that environment. So I did my best to remove as much of the mold as I could and sprayed them lightly with ethyl alcohol which is quick drying. I didn't wash them or anything. But to just try and kill any of the remaining mold spores that might be present. And as soon as the vermiculite arrived, got them packed right away. I expect that I currently have about 59 varieties, I think, out of that original 70-ish, which is pretty good. Like, I'm not complaining. That's pretty good. So I think I'll probably lose a few more. One, due to some of them are mother tubers that may not overwinter very well. They are prone to rotting. And also that mold issue. Some of them may have been too far gone for me to save, and they're in storage. I just won't know. In about another month, I will do like my first winter check on them and pull them all out and check everything over and see how they are. And I'll give an update then. The last issue, I guess, maybe not necessarily failure, but an issue that we're having is that, well, up until this week, which is cold now, we have been having an extremely warm fall, and there are some dahlias that are sprouting. So I think I've told you all before, but for anyone that's new or if you've forgotten, like we don't have a garage or a cold storage area to overwinter the tubers. I kept them in an unfinished basement last year with the vent closed and towels stuffed under the door to keep that room a little cooler. So it was around, like the rest of the house is probably in the 68 to 70 degree range, and in that little basement room was between 60 and 65 probably Fahrenheit. So they're down there now and hopefully not sprouting anymore, but that was the last issue we were having. I guess I'll just quickly mention some of the ones that I lost this year. And many of these are ones that either had no eye or rotted after planting. There were a couple from last year. So one of them was Hilltop Lost Treasure, which didn't actually bloom last year, and it was a really weak tuber. So I wasn't 100% surprised. I am sad because I really wanted to see that bloom, and it is one that I will try to replace probably. Another one was Juliet. That was one that I had gotten from Walmart last year, and it overwintered, but it was next to some of the infected tubers that I had last year with gall, and it looked suspicious, and I was like, I'm not gonna mess with that. I'm just gonna throw them out. And the last one was Silver Years, which I was a little surprised because I think I had like 5 or 6 tubers that I had thought overwintered fine, but they just never sprouted. It looked like maybe they had a little bit of rot near the crown, and perhaps that just rotted out any area that had eyes. I'm not really sure what went on there. And some of the new ones that I got that didn't grow, which was disappointing. And similar, I think I only had, there was one tuber that I had that the company shipped in March in Canada, which you should not ship tubers in March in Canada. It was Strawberry Cream. It arrived frozen and mushy. They did refund me, so no issues there, but it was also a seed company that orders the imported tubers. 3 tubers that I had this year were the same situation. They were imported tubers that I received from a seed company without really realizing that they weren't, growers themselves. So we'll talk about that in the successes, I guess, but going forward, I'll only be purchasing from growers themselves. And hopefully, they know better not to ship tubers in March. But some of the other ones that I lost, and this was mostly just a few of them had no eye or never sprouted, and the rest were mostly a rotted after planting situation. So we lost Black Narcissist, Pooh, Golden Torch, Natalie G, which was also a bummer. Strawberry Cream, which I talked about, Hilltop Lost Treasure, which I talked about, Juliet, Rosella, Dawn's Delight, and Seduction. So a couple of those are on my replace list. A couple of them I'm like, well, maybe it wasn't meant to be. So now that we've talked about the bummers, let's talk about the successes. So first success, I think almost all of them made it through storage. I had that issue with Silver Years, sorry, having a moment. But for the most part, everything made it through storage. There were a couple that were starting to go a little wrinkly. They were starting to lose some moisture. The vast majority were still nice and firm, in really good shape. Many of them were starting to eye up when I pulled them out of storage. A couple of them were overachievers, like Sunny Boy was already growing roots. And again, that's to be expected when, you know, I knew my storage was too warm. So that was great. And I did the vermiculite in the plastic bins, and that's what I'm doing this year again. I found success with it last year, so I'm just carrying on with that. Another thing that was a bonus this year is that it might be due to the late start that I had in actually planting them outdoors, but there were fewer pests at planting. So last year, when they were small and just kind of out of the ground, they were getting demolished by earwigs and I think slugs. I'm not really sure. I think it was mostly earwigs. And this year there seemed to be, and we definitely still had lots of earwigs. And it might be that they were in a different location too. Like some of these got planted at the community garden in town, and knock on wood, I didn't see many earwigs there this summer. And at home, they actually got planted in the raised beds. So perhaps just there were fewer earwigs there than where I planted them last year. But there were fewer pests when they were small, and they seemed to not get knocked back as quickly as they did last year. I did make the switch. I mentioned this earlier, but I did get most of the tubers. The vast majority came from actual growers, Canadian growers mostly. Well, actually all. I didn't import any tubers. And I found far less disease this year than last year. Almost everything I bought from Walmart last year was diseased, and I will not be going back. I'm only going to purchase from growers going forward. And specifically this year, I think only Nova Scotia growers. Not for any reason, like, I mean, there's wonderful Canadian growers across the country, but I'm not looking for very many, and there are 3 places in particular in Nova Scotia that I think I will be getting. Any tubers that I purchased this year will be from them. I did have lots of blooms despite the late start. So, like I said, not everything bloomed. About a third didn't bloom, but what did bloom was wonderful, and I enjoyed them. And you can go check out those videos that I had earlier on some of the new blooms that I had blooming this year. I look forward to seeing the other ones next year that didn't bloom, but I am grateful for the ones that did bloom. I think I have one that was supposed to be Hawaii. It's not Hawaii. So I only had a couple misnamed dahlias, so I'm calling them not whatever their name was. So not Hawaii was the first to bloom. It was at the community garden. It was also amongst the first batch to be planted, so that makes sense. Things grew really well at the community garden, so I think next year I will plant some dahlias there again. Because of the state of the world and rising food costs and things like that, Jarrett's really gung-ho to focus on food next year and fewer flowers, and I can do fewer flowers, but I think dahlias are going to remain high on my priority list. So I might not grow quite as many at the community garden this year as I did, well, next year as I did this year. But there definitely will be some dahlias there, and they did grow very well there. So I look forward to that. Like I mentioned, there was no obvious disease this year. There was no gall. There's a couple that I would like to keep an eye on next year for possible viruses, but I didn't take very good care of them this year, and I think it was probably more of a nutrient deficiency than it was an obvious virus. There were also fewer wireworm issues this year, although that might be what some of the early rot issues were with some of the tubers that didn't grow and rotted once they were planted outside. I didn't see any in the raised beds when I was digging dahlias, and I saw only like one or two along the edges where they mow grass at the community garden, and the inside middle beds where I didn't see a single wireworm. So that was lovely. And I think it's, you know, for only my second year seriously growing dahlias, I think it's a win to have about, I only lost a dozen varieties. I still have 59 of the 70-ish that I started with. So that is a win in my book. So like I said, next year going forward, I'm definitely going to cut back in that I'm not going to be pursuing as many new varieties like I did last year. Like I went overboard, completely self-admitted I went overboard. 50 was way too many, and I did get overwhelmed, and that was part of what happened in the spring. But aside from one or two that might be on my replace list or that were on a wish list that I wasn't able to get last year, I don't think I'll be purchasing any. Like, I mean 5 or less. Which I'm okay with. Like, this is plenty of dahlias, and I have a lot of the ones already that I really wanted to grow and was really in love with. And, you know, I'm going to focus on Nova Scotia growers, and I'm going to be moving them at home. I'm not going to be planting them in the raised beds again. They are going to go back where they were last year, which was in a new bed that I put in along the south side of our house. Part of the reason I didn't plant them there this year is because I did have those few plants with gall last year, and I didn't want that to spread. There's kind of different information about how long it takes for gall to disappear, and leafy gall specifically is what I'm talking about. I haven't experienced crown gall yet, knock on wood. But there's different information about how long that lingers in the soil, and I didn't want to take any chances. But I think after 2 winters and an entire growing season, it is safe enough for me to feel comfortable planting dahlias back in that bed next year. And I think that will be the main dahlia bed. I think I was able to fit between 35 and 40 in there last year, and some will go at the community garden, and I'm sure I can find a few areas to tuck a few in here and there for dahlias that I want multiples of. So that is the plan for next year. Now, it wouldn't be a seasonal wrap up if we didn't talk about some of my favorites. So not everything from last year bloomed again this year. So, you know, I might forget some of my favorites from last year because I didn't get to see them again this year. But 5 that remain my favorites from last year are Cornell Bronze, which is such a cool, like, it's such a cool color because it can blend and go with a lot of things. And I grew it at the community garden this year, which has complete full sun all day, and it was actually pinker there this year than it was here last year. It was a little more coppery bronzy here last year, and I loved the pinker version of it. So I think I will probably plant it there again next year, just because I liked the color variation there better. Thomas Edison remains a favorite. It's so pretty. That purple is so saturated. It's gorgeous. Cafe au lait, there's a reason that it's popular. It's just a lovely flower. I didn't have as many this year as I did last year. I just had that one clump that I thought was disease-free. Everything else last year did have leafy gall. So I kept it kind of secluded. It was at the community garden. And of those few clumps, everything still looks healthy. So this was their second growing season. I'm fairly confident that it can take longer. My understanding is that it can take longer to show up, but generally it's within that first year or two. So I'm fairly confident that they're disease free. Another one from last year was that one that I'm calling not bride to be. It kind of looks like bride to be, but I don't know what it actually is. It was supposed to be a cafe au lait, but I love that flower. It's a white water lily type, and it's very prolific. It was one of the first ones to start blooming this year and will remain a favorite. And it's kind of the same story. It was from Walmart and looks to remain disease-free as well. So I'm very happy about that. And my final favorite from last year, which remains a favorite, is Ben Houston. Wouldn't typically be my first color choice, but I love the form. I love how large the flower is, and yet it still has like a decent vase life. It lasts longer than Cafe au lait or Thomas Edison in a vase, and it's gorgeous. It's a favorite. So to round out maybe my top dozen this year, I have 7 from this year that were new to me to add to my favorite list. So number 1 obviously is Peaches and Cream. There's a reason it's as popular as Cafe au lait. It was larger than I expected. I don't know why I thought it would be smaller, but it's actually a decent sized dahlia. The colors are gorgeous. It makes like the most perfect ball. The petals just wrap all the way around, and it's just so cool. It's not like anything else that I grow. Grand Finale actually ended up being one of my favorites. It's one that I think Jarrett picked it out. He bought me like 8 or 9 dahlias last year for Christmas, which, I mean, he's a keeper, right? When he buys you dahlias. So it's quite a large one, and it has, I don't know if it would be considered like a semi-cactus or something, like the petals kind of incurve towards the center of the flower. I'll throw some pictures up and stuff so you guys know what I'm talking about too. But I actually really liked that one. And one that I was pretty sure I was gonna love and ended up loving was Karma Chocolate. It is just, it's another one of those so saturated, jewel-toned colors that it just looks like velvet. And I loved the shape of it and the petals. Like, it was awesome, and I'm definitely looking forward to growing it again next year. I loved all of the Ferncliff. I think there was 3 Ferncliff dahlias that I grew for the first time this year, but my favorite was Ferncliff Pearl. It was a really nice white and had a really lovely form. I really liked that dahlia. Another one that was a favorite this year that actually I did grow last year, but it didn't bloom last year. And it was originally from Dollarama. It was supposed to be Arabian Night, but it is not Arabian Night. It's larger and a different form and a different color, although it is like what I would call like a burgundy or a black. And I just loved it. And I am hoping beyond hope that it overwinters, because it is one of the ones that I had cut at the community garden a week before I actually dug it, and it had a lot of rot from water getting down into the stem. It had a giant stem. And there was like, you know, like there were several cups of water that came out of that stem when I dug it up and dumped it out. So that was a bummer, and I have no idea what it was, so I can't even replace it if I do lose it. But I really liked that one. Sweet Love was another one. There was a few this year that I was really looking forward to in those kind of lighter pink tones. Sweet Love, Natalie G, and Sweet Natalie, I think I kind of all was thinking in the same kind of color family feeling, and I think Sweet Love was my favorite. I really, really loved that flower, and I think I liked that it was so pink around the edges, but the center, like as it was still unfurling its petals, was like a creamy color. Like I just loved that flower. And finally, one of my favorites from this year was Caitlin's Joy. The colors were so pretty on it, so delicate and feminine, and I really liked it, and it bloomed later in the season, so I only saw like 1 or 2 blooms, and I can't wait to see it again next year. So that was long-winded. Holy crap, that was a half an hour. I'm gonna try to cut some of that out. And I hope you found that entertaining. Dahlias are one of my favorite things to talk about, and I could literally talk all day about them. But I hope you found that interesting. I thank you for stopping by. I thank you for being patient and listening to that if you have made it to the end of that video. And I hope you come back. Thanks for watching. See you next time.